Part 7, Business Experience and Social Work, Earthquake Tragedy. Chapter 16, Private Secretary and Shopkeeper. If the frequency of strikes indicates the awakening of a laboring class, the year 1920, the year my husband and I returned from our trip through America and Europe, showed remarkable record in that field. Statistics indicate the number of strikes, which ended in closing factories, to be 50 in 1914, the year I was married. During 1919, it increased to 497, the highest number of cases ever reached in the labor history of Japan. Although a business depression in the early part of 1920, following the war boom, slackened the demand for labor, causing a blow to workers' activities. The rights of workers were greatly advanced during this period. Thus capitalism in Japan, which had inherited much of the psychology of our previous social system and had been exploiting to the full the laborers' sense of loyalty to their employers, as daimyos had formerly held them loyal to their feudal masters, now had to face laborers realizing and clamoring for privileges. However, this progressive tide of the modern world had little effect on the life of Japanese ladies, still shut up to all intents and purposes in the old castles of feudalism. "Knowledge is a spring of grief," said some pessimistic philosopher of ours, and it exactly fitted my case. So long as I remained in the realm of feudalistic morality, I could conduct myself according to the virtue of harmony without murmuring, but once I was roused from the conventional code of conduct, I found great difficulties in getting on smoothly within my old surroundings. I was young and energetic and eager to start cutting through the red tape of formality. As soon as he was settled in Tokyo, my husband could not waste a moment in trying to put his ideals into practice. As a sympathizer and member of the Federal Union of Miners of Japan, Kofuso Rengo, which was organized within the Federation of Labor, Rodo Sodome, he shared in its activities. He organized a group in the Federal Union to study labor questions scientifically, a great contribution to the labor movement of that time. The movement hitherto had been limited almost entirely to organization and agitation, and sadly lacked proper intellectual leadership. This organization for the scientific study of labor was transformed later into an independent institute for labor and industrial research. Valuable treatises on social problems resulted, but this institute was dissolved when a law was enacted prohibiting dangerous thought. Independent labor and industrial research were suppressed. My husband's connection with these actual labor developments indicated his strong determination to make better working conditions his aim in life, and I was deeply interested in his ideal. He knew that his concern with labor problems would not harmonize with his position as mining engineer in the Mitsui Company, and as soon as he had presented his reports of his trip in the Western countries, he resigned his post and established an independent business importing foreign books. Up to that time, the book importing business had been almost monopolized by one big firm, and the prices charged for Western books were exorbitant for people who sought the culture and knowledge of the world, and this effort to procure foreign works at a reduced cost for interested Japanese accorded with my husband's general idealism. My own desire to be a self-supporting woman never weakened, although I had come back to face thick walls of tradition and convention. I finally got a cozy little place to try my business ability as a private secretary to Miss Anna Birdsall, hostess secretary to the National YWCA of Japan. My genuine interest in promoting international friendship fitted exactly Miss Birdsall's task of bringing East and West together socially. I helped to introduce Western visitors to Japan and to the Japanese people. This work was not heavy, and I had plenty of time to look after my 2 little children, pay good attention to housekeeping, and observe the complicated formalities of our rural life. I received 50 yen a month for my salary. 50 yen was very little, of course, and was not sufficient to support even myself, yet it meant so much to feel for the first time in my life that I earned something by my own work. It had a different value to me from income obtained from rents on estates or interest on invested capital. The next step we both took to emancipate ourselves from the conventional life was to give up our large residence in Kuishikawa. We moved into a small house built in Western style in the Akasaka district of Tokyo. I missed the old garden and the Japanese rooms with their green mats, the polished wooden corridors, and the sliding doors with their delicate paper covering, but we had decided to live more simply in order to have more time for public activity. The big Japanese houses are designed for a life marked by plenty of leisure for their masters and plenty of work for the servants. If one could afford to spend all one's working hours enjoying the beauty of nature, I certainly would recommend a Japanese house and a Japanese garden. Even after seeing beautiful gardens in Italian or Spanish styles in many places in the West, from the most sophisticated aesthetic point of view, I still give my first allegiance to the gardens of my country, but we were too young and too enthusiastic about our interest in present-day problems to be preoccupied with beauty. We did not hesitate a second to attempt to practice in our daily life the things in which we believed. Hastily, we parted with our old home and started a new one, intending to be both practical and energetic. My 2 sons were sent to kindergarten in the Paresis school, where I had spent my early childhood. I enjoyed the hours at home as a busy mother, and worked as happy business woman during other parts of the day. I kept my position as her secretary until Miss Birdsall went back to America. After a year's interval, during which I went on a trip to Korea and China with my husband, I took up a business career again. One day a friend of mine, Mr. Alexander Nagai, a Catholic with a German mother, asked me if I would like to enter the wool yarn importing business. He offered me a sales agency for Minerva yarn, which comes from America. I was especially glad to accept his offer, since the object of the business was to raise a fund for the support of the leper hospital at Gotemba, carried on by a Catholic mission. I saw good reasons for promoting this Minerva yarn business, the leper hospital, and also the prospect of using my earnings for birth control education, which I was planning to start. I knew only too well that in Japan, the most difficult undertaking imaginable was to raise funds for any social work, on account of the absence of a sense of social responsibility on the part of a people whose interest is limited to their family circles. This would be especially true of such an enterprise as birth control education, for the idea of spacing children was not readily understood or approved by the conservative and the rich. Besides this purpose of raising money for the Catholic charity and my own social enterprise, I had in mind another thing. It was to offset the attitude of my own class of samurai towards material interest. I take the liberty here to quote from Dr. Natobe's essay on Samuraism. The mercantile calling was as far removed from Bushido as the North is from the South. To a samurai, trade and commerce were small concerns to which it was derogatory to his dignity to pay any attention. Hence, the effect of Bushido upon the early days of our commerce was not appreciable. This was naturally followed by a low morality among the industrial classes. One vulnerable point of Bushido, which is shared with all class morality, is that it meted out honor in unequal degrees to the various vocations of society, first of all to the samurai, then to the tillers of the soil, then to mechanics, and least of all to merchants, the last named being considered by the rest as the least honorable, naturally adjusted their moral tone to their reputation. Still, as I have already observed, honesty is a virtue easiest learned in commercial transactions, for its reward is not laid as far off as heaven after death, but at the counter, or else at the court, when the bills are due. In these circumstances, the samurai were being starved, while bold money-makers of another class were plunging forward with their enterprise and winning economic and political dominance. Still, the feeling of horror for mercantile transactions resulting in the making of money had its root so deep in the samurai mind that it was almost a revolutionary act for a lady of the peerage to open a shop in Tokyo. I expected severe criticism, but I joyously launched my yarn shop, with its little school adjoining, in which Western knitting was taught to girls and women who were anxious to make jackets and sweaters for their children, and their men, and shawls and gloves for themselves. Our winters are very cold, and these garments would give great comfort. At the same time, I planned to furnish knitting jobs to women at home, in cases where they were in urgent need of earning a part or the whole of the family livelihood. My shop was in an up-to-date building in the Kobayashi district, in the same building where my husband had his bookshop, the business center of Tokyo. The glass cases with white painted frames were filled with colorful yarn balls and fashionable sweaters, jumpers, scarves, and ski outfits gaily decorated the shop. Soft, comfortable-looking dresses for children were the particular temptation of young mothers. The customers consisted of persons who wanted something very chic and high grade, including many ladies among the Puresse's school graduates, and even royal princesses who would order their golfing outfits in my shop. A few whispered that they believed in ladies going ahead in this sort of business enterprise, and treated me with respect. Others behaved in the haughtiest manner, looking upon me with contempt for my mercantile pursuit. Some kabuki actors' wives, who always tried to be ultra-fashionable, came to my shop, and on finding that Angora was the most expensive yarn, with one accord decided to make their dear husband's underwear of that precious material. Journalists, writing about my shop, afforded me without expense the best kind of advertising, and this high-grade imported yarn brought good prices. I succeeded in giving fairly profitable jobs to middle-class women who learned knitting and took their work to their own homes to meet the demand for finished goods. I published a book on knitting, which sold 13,000 copies. I traveled to many towns to teach knitting, even as far as Hokkaido, in the snow. Almost every place I visited, in the interest of my knitting business, brought the request that I should talk on birth control principle. So, my birth control propaganda and the knitting business were strongly interwoven. I had 5 girls and 2 men at work in the shop, and several young women who helped me teach in my knitting classes. Among my assistants was Miss Shigeko Nakajima, a dear young person, whose 2 brothers, Mr. Hideo and Mikihiko Nagata, were popular men in the literary circle of Tokyo. She was a fine example of Japanese womanhood, struggling in her unhappy married life to be economically independent, while remaining loyal to her husband. She was a thoroughly gentle wife, and served her husband like a faithful slave, as tradition required of every Japanese woman at home. She worked hard and competently at the office, and fairly ran back to her kitchen to prepare a good dinner for her husband, and to welcome him at the close of the day. However, her husband was utterly lacking in sympathy for this sweet little woman, and finally drove her out of his house. She had to find refuge in the Catholic convent in snowbound Hokkaido. Her heroic struggle was made the theme of a story by one of her brothers. It was widely read, and drew sympathy from many women, whose fate in present Japanese society savors of cruelty. My yarn business went ahead with unexpected success, until the moment of that terrible catastrophe which destroyed everything in Tokyo and its vicinity on September 1st, 1923, the earthquake. My example in opening a business road for women and battling with the feudalistic prejudice against commercialism may have counted for very little. However, it is since that experiment was made that our public has taken woman's activities in the mercantile field for granted. Today, we have in Japan a good deal of this kind of work carried on successfully by women. While I was active in this yarn importing and selling business, I undertook one more task, which also turned out well. During 1920 and 1921, the Great Famine occurred in South Russia, extending over a huge territory and including hundreds of thousands of people. Relief work was asked of every nation, regardless of their approval or disapproval of Soviet Russia. Kind-hearted people of the world could not be callous to this great disaster, and philanthropists religious groups, social workers, and advocates of international friendship all proceeded to take part in this relief work. In Japan, sympathy for the starving Russians was genuine, and women were urged to give substantial aid. A relief group was organized immediately, and on the committee served Madame Akiko Yasano, a poetess, Miss Kiku Yamakawa, a social thinker, Miss Yuriko Shujo, a popular young novelist, and others including myself. My office at Kiyobashi became their headquarters, and the actual work of relief was put under my direction. The committee labored energetically day and night, and finally succeeded in raising the sum of £790, which it sent to the famine districts through the Foreign Office of our government. This amount collected by Japanese women was a surprise to them and to Tokyo in general. It helped to swell the total relief administered by Japan. It encouraged our group and encouraged other women in the progressive attitude. Chapter 17. Trip to Korea, Manchuria, and China. After I had seen the countries of the West, I wanted very much to see Korea and China. My husband had already traveled there, and his accounts of his trip excited my interest. Finally, in the autumn of 1922, he took me to spend 2 months in North China, South Manchuria, and Korea. During the journey, I kept a diary. November 13th, 1921. A warm, unrestrained feeling governs me when I realize that I am starting on a visit to my neighbor countries to see other people of black hair and dark skin. Although I have never seen them, I have a feeling of visiting brothers and sisters with whom we Japanese have enjoyed a common civilization of a long and wonderful origin. November 16th, 1921. The face suggesting a tempo of Adant, the long, ragged whiskers, the primitive-looking loose, bleached cotton costume, the long pipe, and the ridiculously small black hat. This is the meek-looking Korean man, in sharp comparison to the small and quick-moving Japanese. This was my first impression of Korea after visiting in Seoul. The Great South Gate and many of the palaces are beautiful pieces of architecture. Won't the gigantic new Western buildings built by us in front of the Korean Royal Palace humiliate us in later years when we truly realize that we did not appreciate the beauty of native Korean architecture? I saw 3 different types of the Korean family while I was in Seoul, and through them I grasped some phases of Korean life in upper, middle, and low-class Korean families. The house to which I was introduced first represented the old native aristocracy. The family spent a sum of 2,000 yen a month for the household expenses, including the support of more than 100 servants. This amount of money for household expenses would mean a millionaire status in Japan, yet to my surprise I could not find anything splendid or luxurious or even neat in the domicile. Life seemed to be on the plane of hibernation, lazy, inactive, and joyless. In this household, the woman's apartments were strictly separated from the men's. but husbands were allowed to enter all the family precincts. The ladies, in their seclusion, were meek and delicate. I could not speak to them on account of the difference in our languages, but I was told that they were in family mourning, which would last for 3 years, so much longer than in present-day Japan. As an Oriental woman, I had been thinking a great deal of the social barrier I had known in our unreasonable conventions, but here I was driven into deeper dismay by the Korean ladies, who were put under more fetters and lived a more depressing life of wasteful patience. The second of the houses which I visited was a good example of middle-class family shelter. This was a friendly Christian family, considerably influenced by Western missionaries in its customs and outlook. The third family belonged to the poor and lived in what could hardly be called a house at all, a clay pit, dark, dirty, with stuffy air and queer odors. The upper and lower Korean families alike seemed to me to exhibit a lazy attitude towards life. Everywhere in Korea, I was impressed by the lack of vitality. I saw how actively the Japanese directed this annexed people. More than ever before, I realized what the words conqueror and conquered meant as I traveled in Korea. Nevertheless, Korean habits and customs betrayed Chinese and Japanese elements. The food, for instance, is not as rich as Chinese, but is very much like it. The delicious hot-spiced pickles made of white vegetables are a main dish. Like the Japanese, the Koreans remove their shoes before entering a room, and the architecture closely resembles that of China. November 18th, 1921. Messrs. Lao, Shu, and Kim came to the station to see us off. Warm friendship with the native Korean people is the only hope for adjustment in the relations between the Koreans and the Japanese. At 11 o'clock at night, we crossed the Oryoko River, the northern border of Korea. My husband explained to me about the economic and strategic significance of this river, while our train was crossing the long bridge over it. When I looked out through the window, a late autumn moon was reflected on the water, chilling the more our thoughts, concentrated on history of 2 Japanese wars, one with China and the other with Imperial Russia, with Korea in the balance. I recalled my childhood with my old grandfather in Kamakura, how excited he was each time he got a newspaper extra announcing another Japanese victory in the field, how I exclaimed, "Banzai," with my innocent brothers, waving the sun disk flag of white and red. Now I pondered on the way Japan is growing bigger and stronger at the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of my countrymen's lives. Japan has rested her standard of glory on the graves of her heroic patriots. She has expanded so fast that no other nation could imitate the pace of her progress. I too have grown while my country has been growing. Korea was annexed to Japan while I was in the primary school. Now in my maturity, I was visiting the conquered race. What will be the future of Korea? I asked my husband. He did not answer, but seemed lost in meditation as he gazed down on the cold scenery of the Oryoko. As we entered the territory of South Manchuria, we both exclaimed, bless the heart of our Korean brothers. November 19th, 1921. Arrived at Mukden in the early morning. The chilly air reminded us of the winter in New York. Suddenly my husband said, "Let's go to Harbin." I understood the impulse. I knew that his dream of getting into the country forbidden to the Japanese had revived. Kalyan had been gathered in. Here, a vast expanse of land spread like an ocean until it touched the heaven with no obstacles to break the flatness of the landscape. Our open carriage, drawn by 2 donkeys, ran over the trackless plain, in clouds of dust, dimly covering this primitive traffic on the sand ocean. We arrived at the old tombs of the Qing emperors, and stood among the rubbish of past splendor. The palaces, once built with the labor of millions of human beings, now lay overgrown with weeds and shrubs. The interior afforded safe refuge for birds and bats, their presence intensifying the emotions aroused by the ruins of an empire. November 22nd, 1921. Left Port Darin. Our boat sailed at noon from Tsingtao. The short voyage, Darin and Tsingtao, took only 24 hours on the calm sea. Cabin passengers are few, but Chinese coolies crowded the decks of the boats. The coolies, who had emigrated from the province of Shantung to South Manchuria, were now coming back to their homeland with their small savings. They were the most important customers of the ship company. Alas, these passengers were treated in the most inhospitable way by the company. Coolies, are they not human beings? No, they are the most convenient cargoes. They manage themselves. They do not wait until the cranes lift them into the ship. They are a self-transporting and self-feeding shipload. A few women and children were among them. The whole number spent the day and night on the open deck, the cold sea wind of winter blowing continually over them. Instinctively, we were gratefully reminded of the Japanese Mikado, and of the fact that there is no class of human beings in Japan as unprotected as the Chinese coolies. Nowhere in the world had we seen laborers so diligent and at the same time so able to endure a wretched standard of living. They exist only to offer their muscles or even their lives to be exploited by foreign capital, which is often their master under the beautiful name of helping China and developing Chinese natural resources. Without the coolies, there would be no interest luring foreign capital to this backward land. Will they ever learn to resist human exploitation, or will they forever merely exist and breed slaves for the satisfaction of others? The pathetic picture of colonial labor saddened me. November 23rd, 1921. Arrived at Tsingtao and took a room in the pension Lineman. Tsingtao is a beautiful town, built by the Germans in their effort to obtain political and naval prestige in the Far East. The town faces Shidzue Bay, with the British naval station on the opposite shore. The fact that German civilization had been transplanted to this Oriental mandate could be seen in the up-to-date fortifications and in the character of the architecture of the homes, hotels, clubhouses, and school buildings in Tsingtao. Today, however, the Japanese hold this territory under military occupation, ceded by treaty following the World War. November 25th, 1921. My husband had gone to investigate some of the coal mines around Shantung Peninsula. Madame Lineman, our German landlady, kindly took me to see some of the former German residences, whose charm I could appreciate owing to the fact that my father's house is built in the German style from a German architect's design. One house we visited was magnificently furnished and decorated, witnesses of its former social glory. Luxuriant tropical plants were growing in an adjoining greenhouse and on the sunny veranda, though the master and mistress had gone, leaving these to the care of their Chinese servants. Only yesterday this house was occupied by a happy family. I went upstairs into the splendid bedroom of the daughter of the house, who had left there a picture of her wedding. Her husband was carried away by the cruel hand of war in the midst of their honeymoon trip. The heads of 2 brown horses, which she had been embroidering on a green silk cushion, were left unfinished on her bureau. A little present intended for her father was found in the master's room, unpacked. Oh, how often have such war tragedies repeated themselves since the beginning of human history, and how long is mankind to repeat the process of construction and destruction? Will not defeat sometime visit our nation, now victorious? I was shown the official residence of the commander-in-chief of the Japanese army at Qingdao, like a castle of old Europe, but with modern accommodations. A young cadet in a khaki uniform with a red collar led us through the house. He showed us a magnificent ornate hall overlooking Kiachao Bay, and pointed out to us an endless number of works of art, reiterating many times and proudly, "This is a war trophy." Then he called attention to a huge cannon set in front of the entrance to this mansion, seemingly unaware of the way in which the artistic effect was broken by this ugly monster. I was also taken to see the former German clubhouse, which was now used for a temporary law court. My imagination conjured up a person summoned on some criminal charge to stand before its old bar, and the judge solemnly passing judgment behind the counter where bubbling beer and cocktails were once merrily served. The world is changing. It is certainly moving rapidly. The heavy tapestries and curtains had been resigned to the dust and the rough handling of new occupants. Again and again, I asked myself, where have we Japanese learned such a thing as fighting with foreign nations? Are we born fighters? Do we never appreciate a civilization of high order? My knowledge of Japanese history forbade such a conclusion. I knew enough to answer myself. We were once a peaceful nation. We developed a high civilization of our own, distinguished for its artistic qualities. Our fighting is only a part of our imitation of what the West has done in the past and is still doing, and I longed to have my people pass through this period of imitation and realize their own creative power for the sake of human progress. November 26, 1921. I went to a silk factory in Qingdao, run by a Japanese proprietor, where young Chinese girls in blue cotton native dresses were working. Thousands of them operate machinery 10 hours a day for a wage, or 15 cents a day. Poor girls with small bound feet, recruited to serve modern capitalistic demands. I have never seen such cheap labor anywhere else. The world's laborers still have a long way to go on the road to a decent standard of living. So long as any number of them remain in such a condition, their existence will be a menace to other laborers who have gained a humane status, because capital moves into the places where labor is cheap. I visited Tiznan, Tientsin, and Peking. I saw the ruins of a great empire everywhere, and at the same time and place, Chinese people continuing their trades, haggling and peddling, buying and selling, unmolested in the streets. What a busy people they are, even the armies of beggars who swarmed everywhere, and often besieged foreign travelers riding in rickshaws. Poverty stared one in the face on all sides, devoid of a strong government to protect them, without organized effort to preserve their rights. The Chinese are a woefully helpless people. They die like flies when a long drought causes famine, as it often does. They lose their houses and farms when the god of the river brings a flood, as he frequently does. Yet at theaters and at hotels, Chinese women are richly dressed, with ropes of pearls in their hair, diamond and jade necklaces around their delicate throats, bracelets on their wrist, rings on their fingers, and pendants fastened to their ears, literally carrying fortunes on their persons, and seemingly oblivious to the havoc about them. I called upon an ex-president of the Chinese Republic, General Li, and his family at his mansion in the French Concession in Tientsin. What a pity that a man of China has to live in alien territory to protect his own life and property. Young Mr. Li had been educated in Tokyo at the Peers School, and I had known him well there. I remember one day my younger brother carelessly saying to Mr. Li that the Chinese were a very dirty people. Mr. Li retorted that he knew many dirty Japanese in Tokyo. After seeing how he lived in China, I appreciated his resentment at the charge my brother made against a whole race. There are 400 million Chinese. One must always be cautious about criticizing races and nations in sweeping generalities. My trip to China and Korea raised questions upon which one could ponder forever. Chapter 18. Birth Control Movement. Invasion of Sangorism in Japan. Since the time of Commodore Perry, no American has created a greater sensation in the land of the Mikado than Margaret Sanger. Our historians have described Commodore Perry's visit to Japan in 1852 as the invasion of modern industrialism, resulting practically in the end of the Japanese Pacific policy of isolation, which had ruled for hundreds of years. Now they must describe Margaret Sanger's visit to Japan in 1922 as the invasion of Sangorism, bearing to an island empire, distraught by its swarming millions, the pacific means of harvesting the fruits of machine civilization. Today, it is greatly feared in many quarters that overpopulation in Japan may turn out to be a world menace. No other country is really so overcrowded. Japan proper, the size of which is about that of the state of California, has a population of 67,837,000, according to the census of 1931. The average rate of increase for the last 5 years was 34 per thousand, adding about 940,000 newborn Japanese every year to the teeming multitude. But such figures standing alone give us no idea of their true significance. They must be considered in relation to the land of the nation. In this connection we find an average density for the population of 400 persons per square mile, making Japan one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Only a few highly industrialized nations, such as Belgium, Holland, and Great Britain, surpass it. The degree of density naturally varies in different parts of the country, according to their climate and productivity. Japan is gifted with scenic beauty. Her mountains provide a constant variation in the landscape by a succession of peaks, but this mountainous land is unfit for cultivation. When therefore we calculate the density of population per square mile, not of territory, but of cultivatable area, the Japanese density is 2,490 per square mile, double the density of Belgium, and over 4 times that of England. Who could foresee such a problem of congestion in the day when Commodore Perry lured the reluctant islanders into international competition so coaxingly with his wonderful gifts, including telegraph apparatus, a locomotive and tender, 100 gallons of whiskey, 8 baskets of Irish potatoes, and similar attractions, exotic presents from representatives of the young republic to a dynasty more than 2,500 years old. In 1846, 6 years before Commodore Perry reached the Japanese coast with an American fleet, Japan's population was 26,207,000, according to the census of the time. This figure had risen to 59,560,000 in the year of Margaret Sanger's visit. It is clear that the Japanese population had more than doubled within 70 years of modernization. This situation was worrying many Japanese before Miss Sanger arrived. Let us examine the social conditions which underlay the welcome given Sangerism in Japan. In 1920, Japan was shocked by a high treason case, a conspiracy entered into by a group of anarchists to overthrow the imperial throne by force. The loyal subjects of the emperor were stunned, and the government felt warranted in prohibiting any social movement whatsoever. Prominent leaders of a socialistic or anarchist bent were all arrested, and the seeds of political criticism were apparently destroyed. The very word social came to be a synonym for treason. Even economists had to refrain from using that word in their scientific studies. Citizens who projected reforms were considered rebels against society. Any kind of social thinking was apparently crushed in the budding stage. However, as months and years passed, the buds took on new life. Through the irresistible influence of the World War, social and labor problems surged to the foreground of thought. Their preeminence was emphasized in the literature of an anarchist tendency which made its way into the market at the time, and in a syndicalist labor movement which took form during the years 1914 and 1915. The March Revolution in Russia had distinct echoes in my country. It was in these days that the word democracy was interpreted to Japanese students by Professor Sakuzo Yoshino, then a professor of political science in the Imperial University of Tokyo. Dr. Yoshino's advocacy of democracy gained such warm supporters among the young university men and among other intellectuals that it seemed as if the democratic ideal was going to sway the whole nation. With democracy was associated internationalism, so the nationalists were alarmed. Some nervous reactionaries, frightened by this new tide of social awakening, organized a society called Ranitkai and challenged Dr. Yoshino to meet the charge of being a national enemy. The new force of a democratic ideal and the conserving power of tradition waged open warfare. The nationalists even adopted terrorism as a tactic for defeating their rivals. Finally, the dispute was submitted to public judgment in a mass assembly. An audience numbering about 2,000 listened to the debate between Dr. Yoshino and a representative of the conservative point of view. Loud cheers greeted the remarks of Dr. Yoshino as he presented the progressive viewpoint, and the atmosphere of this open debate was electric, with the changing currents of Japanese opinion. After that, the conservative nationalist retired from public debate. Young people grew bolder. A society calling itself the New Men's Society was organized among the students at the Imperial University of Tokyo under the leadership of Dr. Yoshino. The New Men's Society stimulated progressive social thought, but it did more than think. Its sessions not only rallied intellectuals for discussion within the group, but it sent forth young people actually to take part in the social movement, the fruits of whose labor were later unmistakable. It was the cradle of many prominent leaders of the social, democratic, and communist parties. The syndicalist tendency in the Japanese labor movement was strengthened by the October Revolution in Russia, but in the face of other events, the labor movement as a whole veered towards political Marxism. However, the idea of democracy still occupied the central position in our social thought. It was evident even in the social practices of those days. Errand boys, factory girls, and domestic maids, who had been considered by feudalistically minded people as belonging to a semi-slave class, now received the honorific san, which corresponds to the English Mr., Mrs., and Miss. Thus Miss Maid, Miss Factory Girl, and Mr. Boy strode to the front of the stage. This would appear a trifling act to Westerners, but in fact it was a great advance for a people so recently feudal. The idea of democracy accompanied by a pacifist ideal of internationalism finally dominated a people disillusioned with respect to nationalist and conservative leadership everywhere by the results of the World War. The First Washington Conference in 1919 spurred on the new political philosophy. In Japan, women of the burgess class organized a society for promoting international peace. Some of the advanced teachers in the primary schools started a movement to abolish warlike passages from the textbooks used by little boys and girls, an expression of the anti-jingoistic temper now in force, and secured deletions. Young ladies agreed that militarists were the most unpopular suitors in their marriage considerations. Finally, this tide of democratic conviction overwhelmed the masses, and the battle for universal suffrage began amid great popular excitement. The authorities tried to suppress the universal suffrage movement by force, but their persecution only inflamed the masses, and like wildfire on dried stubble field, the demand for enfranchisement spread. The people of Japan were acquiring self-confidence. This was in part due to the prosperity of the industrial system of the country, which had advanced rapidly during the World War, giving unusually wide employment to men and women, who before had thought of life and themselves merely in connection with the feudal family system, and were now being individualized. But the panic which came upon expanded industry, suddenly shrinking the labor market and thrusting men and women out on the street, an army of the unemployed, sharpened the will to self-assertion. Individuals who had broken out of family confinement were unable to go back to it to be fed again in a feudalistic economy. Feudalism was wrecked by the panic. Naturally, this condition created social unrest and intensified labor and political struggles. Forced to bend under the weight of public opinion, the Diet in 1924 established manhood suffrage at least, but at the same time a law was passed for the strict punishment of dangerous thoughts. This prohibitive measure had been planned by the authorities several years before, but it had not been enacted as a law on account of the influence of the democratic ideal. Now, in the form of compromise, a severer statute was inscribed on the books than that famous pact of Osnabrück, Gegen die Sozialdemokratie, sponsored by Bismarck in Germany, late in the 19th century. Anyway, this progress in the social consciousness of the people furnished a ready background for the birth control movement, which I term Sangerism. Religion was, moreover, an asset with us, and not a liability as in the West. In Japan, it has been separated from direct politics for centuries. Buddhism, Shintoism, and the newly introduced Christianity occupy a different social position from that held by religious organizations in the Western world. Religion in Japanese society never rules public opinion through clerical interference, or acts as a social force through the will to power of the clergy. It has no reason for interfering with the birth control movement as such. However, it cannot be denied that Buddhism exercises an influence of a subtle kind on the Japanese mind. The negative morality of Buddhism, utilized by rulers, has inculcated among the Japanese habits of obedience, non-resistance, and resignation. Spiritual beauty is stressed, and material objects are looked upon as mere illusions. How far Buddhist teaching is from the Gospel of Karl Marx. The cardinal virtue of the former is humility and subservience, seen in all its proverbs. You cannot defeat a crying child and the landlord. A stake which lifts its head higher than the others will be driven down. A tall tree is easily blown down by the wind. The main tenet is that humility means happiness. The effect is paralytic with respect to insurgent thought. The Japanese have been taught, for instance, to regard children as treasures of country and of family, which must be produced at all cost, to the limit of potentialities. Parents of offspring whom they cannot support, however hard they work, in their poverty and hunger, may often seek solace in Buddhist philosophy. And yet, despite the pull of long-taught doctrine, the cry for the cure of poverty and hunger grew sharp and bitter in Japan. There are limits beyond which philosophy breaks down. When birth control was offered as a social remedy, the poor Japanese grasped its value quicker than the ruling class, having returned from America full of enthusiasm for this social remedy. I was hailed in the press as the leader in the birth control movement of Japan. Then, when Margaret Sanger arrived en route to China and India, her dynamic personality, as well as her fame, lifted the movement, with which I was struggling, to one of major concern in the nation. The attitude of official Japan towards the visitor was reported in the New York Tribune as prime news, justifying the space of an entire page of narrative and criticism, accompanied by clever cartoons. The paper gave a faithful account of her official reception, with more than the usual amount of wit displayed by them. The Japanese policemen are calling Miss Sanger Sangai-san. Sangai is a Japanese word which may be interpreted to mean destructive to production. This is just one evidence of the extent to which Miss Sanger is being discussed in Japan today, said the Tribune. Perhaps the futility of attempts to repress ideas by government edict was never more conclusively proved than in the case of Miss Sanger's visit to Japan, when she was officially restrained from making public speeches concerning birth control. The people at large heard about her and her work in a dramatic way which took. She became the big story of Japan and the most talked of person in the land. The day she and Admiral Baron Kato, conference delegate from Washington, reached Yokohama on the same steamer, the Baron's picture was diverted to out-of-the-way corners of the Japanese papers, while large photographs of Miss Sanger and her son Grant, who was with her, were featured as first-class news. No group could come together, whether foreign or Japanese, in which she and her theories were not the subject of lively conversation. The attempt to repress Miss Sanger truly acted as a boomerang. She was a stronger magnet than she ever could have been had she been allowed to go about undisturbed, making speeches on birth control. Young Japan was in the mood just then to approve of anything the government condemned. The government thought Miss Sanger would introduce dangerous thoughts. Dangerous thoughts were the breath of life to young Japan. Consequently, when it was announced, first, that the Japanese consul at San Francisco had refused a visa for Miss Sanger's passport, then that she would not be permitted to enter Japan on her arrival in the harbor, and subsequently that if allowed to enter, she would not be granted permission to speak. Young Japan decided that Miss Sanger must be interesting, and discussed her and her theories exhaustively. Miss Sanger had been invited by the Kaizo Reconstruction magazine to stop in Japan on her way to China, and while she was in my country, I had the honor of being her hostess. One of the first things my husband and I had to say to Miss Sanger after she finally landed at Yokohama was that so far as the birth control movement in Japan was concerned, far more had been accomplished by the agitation growing out of the police prohibitions than could ever have come through simple lectures on the subject. The news and editorial columns of both Japanese and foreign newspapers had been full of Miss Sanger ever since it was announced, several weeks before, that she would arrive. By no means, however, had all the comments been favorable. There had been a great deal of bitter criticism and much applause for the bold stand of the police authorities. but the main thing was to get birth control universally discussed, and the advertising helped enormously to do so. Japan watches America very closely now, just as she does all nations, since she has attained national maturity. Perhaps like almost any other youngster lately grown past the gawky stage and attending her first grown-up party, she isn't just sure which fork to use or what to do with the finger bowl. So she watches the other guest. It is easy to see what she would learn concerning birth control by observation of American manners. The head of the police bureau of the Home Office is said to have been in New York at the time Miss Sanger's meeting was raided in the town hall. In order to prevent any such disturbance in Japan, he simply announced that she could not make any speeches. This was the Tribune's explanation of Miss Sanger's situation in Japan, and I think there is a great deal of truth in it. When I was allowed to board the Taiyo Maru and found her in her cabin, waiting for permission to land, I felt very ashamed and sorry that our government should be treating this distinguished foreign guest and valuable gospel bringer so rudely. But finally the matter was so arranged that she could land and could speak at public or private meetings, on condition that she would not talk on the subject of birth control. It was just like drawing a dragon without its fearful eyes. If Miss Sanger was to be allowed to speak without delivering her message, nevertheless, she respected the condition laid down for her entry in her address at the public meeting, called by Kaizo. At every meeting which she attended, she was pressed to say something in regard to her great cause. How could she refuse? My task it was to stand at the entrance door and watch for police spies while Miss Sanger was talking on birth control, banned as dangerous thought by the authorities. Also I watched to see whether her speeches were correctly interpreted, as it is easy for a Japanese translator, however good the intention, to make mistakes with a speech. As I attended every meeting while Miss Sanger was in Tokyo, I heard everything she had to say on the subject. Among many meetings she addressed, the most significant one was presided over by Dr. Baron Shibazaburo Kitazato, prominent as a medical doctor, as well as for being the greatest authority on bacteriology in Japan. No woman, foreign or native, had ever been so well received by Japanese men as was Miss Sanger. The modest, ladylike tone of her voice was something of a surprise to the Japanese, who had expected to see a huge, aggressive-mannered person fussing blatantly with them about their habits. The 10 days which Miss Sanger had planned to spend in Tokyo passed quickly. We wasted the first 3 days with the officials, seeking permission for her to speak. After it was obtained, I took her to various luncheons and dinners, which were in reality intended to be private opportunities for speeches. This made Miss Sanger's schedule overcrowded at first. However, we worked out a program to utilize every minute of her precious time with important interviews, meetings, and receptions. She wished to be taken to the licensed prostitute quarter, the Yoshiwara district, and to Asakusa, the unlicensed quarter. She wanted to see the Kananga Fuchi cotton spinning mill and the life of the factory girls in the biggest plant in Japan. We managed all these expeditions. Miss Sanger not only had a great success in Tokyo, but she was also warmly received by the people of Kyoto and Osaka. The amount she accomplished in raising interest in birth control in Japan was immense, both with respect to the Neo-Malthusian doctrine and its implications for the labor movement. She appeared like a comet, but she left such a vivid and long-enduring impression on the Japanese mind that there is no possible reckoning of the true value of her visit. The birth control idea had first been introduced to Japanese intellectuals in 1902 by Dr. Waman Ukita, a professor in Waseda University. But in the excitement attending preparations for the war with Imperial Russia, Dr. Ukita had to suppress his enthusiasm in the matter. The public hatred towards him was so great that he was called a traitor. Later, there appeared several advocates of birth control from the eugenic standpoint, but their voices were weak, and they made few converts. Then, this Japanese magazine invited Miss Sanger to Japan. In 1920, Mr. Tagayuki Nayame, a social worker who had visited the United States and had had an interview with her, published an article on her work for the first time in a Japanese magazine. There appeared a complete number of the magazine devoted to birth control, but the information and opinions, even of prominent people, betrayed very primitive notions of the matter. Some stated that birth control was just like running away after eating without paying for one's bill. Some stated that they believed in birth control as an ideal or theory, but all we had to do in fact was to observe how a woman whose name was Margaret Sanger was languishing behind prison bars because she advocated the practice of it. Clearly a thing, fine in theory, was harmful when agitated. Shortly after Miss Sanger's visit to Japan, however, a group of interested persons undertook to gather birth control facts and study the question more deeply. Professor Iso Abe of Waseda University headed this group. It included Mr. Bunji Suzuki, the outstanding labor leader, Dr. Tokijiro Kaji, a well-known medical doctor, a prominent socialist and Buddhist, Mr. Kiku Yamakawa, my husband, and myself. Its research prospectus opened, in effect, as follows. The noble spirit of humanism has served to check wasteful conflict between the nations, and the progress of science has decreased the ravages of diseases by revealing their causes. Hence, the tendency to an immense increase in the human birth rate is to be observed. Should this increasing birth rate continue, the shortage of the necessary materials for human existence would in time be appalling, even if the advancing knowledge of science promoted public welfare. Today, our population is growing by about 700,000 new Japanese every year. A recent average is 940,000. This will cause not only severe competition within the nation, but it will become the source of international entanglement. Its distressing aspect is apparent in individual lives. Uncontrolled pregnancy robs the mother of health and raises infant mortality. We had 170 infant deaths per 1,000 in 1917. Overburdens the family economy and prevents a decent education of children. The consequences also are late marriage, increase in the number of illegitimate children, infanticide, abortion, and other social immoralities and tragedies. It is absolutely necessary to avoid any pregnancy when either parent has a disease which should not be transmitted to the offspring. But the right practice of birth control principles should not be an act of immorality. It should be in harmony with social morality. This research society is thus established for the purpose of advocating the above stated principle, July 1922. The birth control work of this society was first started in the educational field. At the same time, it established a clinic for experimentation placed in the People's Hospital, directed by Dr. Kaji, who took charge of the clinic and medical work. I was in charge of the social and business side of this undertaking. As for the educational work of the society, we translated and published Miss Sanger's pamphlet, Family Limitation, and other pamphlets, observing the birth control question from different angles, which I wrote, The Problem of Japanese Population and Birth Control, by my husband, and Birth Control and Biological Aspects, by Professor S. Matsumura of Hokkaido Imperial University. Then we published a periodical named Small Family, and continued our activities, lecturing and contributing articles to other periodicals. On account of the lack of scientific experience, the clinic had but small significance, but the educational attempt of our society aroused a tempest everywhere, evident in the thousands of letters we received of encouragement or of threat. In the Osaka and Kyoto districts, there was another birth control organization, led by Mr. Senji Yamamoto, who was later elected a member of the lower house of the Diet as a representative of the Proletarian Party, only to be killed by the sword of the reactionary party. His organization was actively supported by many labor leaders in that district, its aim being to strengthen the labor struggles by checking excess labor at its source. Mr. Yamamoto was greatly interested in meeting Miss Sanger, as he stated, but his understanding of the birth control principles was not wholly that of Miss Sanger. As a Marxist, he frankly opposed the neo-Malthusian doctrine, and his attitude carried weight in New Japan at that time, since Marx was a great master there. However, he himself did not explain fully the inconsistency between Malthusianism and Marxism. My activity at the front line in our birth control propaganda was a cause of alarm to the people of my own class. It was taken as the fancy of a romantic person, or of one not quite sound in the head. They called me Madame Control, and drew caricatures of me in papers and magazines. It was not seldom that people hissed, pulled one another's sleeves secretly, or smiled ironically at me when they met me in the street or at any other place. Some reactionary countrymen considered me a hateful woman who brought shame on her ancestral house. Instead of urging my sex to bear as many soldiers, noble patriots, as they possibly could, I was even belittling the military glory of the nation, so they said. However, I had friends, even within my own class, such as Countess Teruko Tsugaru, young widow of Count Tsugaru, former daimyo of the Tsugaru clan, Marchioness Sho, wife of the former king Lucho Island, Vice-Countess Tozawa, Miss Nitobe Jr., and Miss Aki Hatano of the editorial staff of the Women's Review. They not only understood and encouraged my work, but even organized a group among their friends to study contemporary thought and problems, as well as to enjoy art and literature. They might be viewed as ladies of leisure, toying with plants in a hothouse, but they were really serious and eager to comprehend the problems of the day, no less than to heighten their cultural charm. The meeting was held at the members' homes by turn, and authorities were invited to lecture to them on such topics as the history of the Japanese labor movement and the problems of Japanese factory girls, which were discussed by Mr. Kato, a leader in the Japanese Miners' Union. Survey of the Developmental of Social Thought, presented by Mr. T. Nosaka, who was active in social research work and later became a member of the Communist Party, and an interpretation of modern literature made by Mr. T. Irishima, a prominent author of socialistic inclinations. Mr. Irishima named our group Raishokai, Coming Light Society, after a phrase extracted from his favorite Chinese poem. My days were full of duties: managing the yarn shop, teaching knitting classes, giving jobs to the women who finished our knitting courses, promoting birth control, and keeping my membership in the Raishokai. One of the treasured experiences of those days followed an invitation from the Miners' Union at the Ashio copper mines to talk on the general subject of birth control. The Ashio copper mines are situated 20 miles to the north beyond the Nikko Mountains, where stand the world-famous Nikko Temple and the Red Lacquer Bridge. The mines then belonged to Baron Furukawa, one of the greatest capitalists in Japan, and this place had become celebrated for its tragic struggles between the laborers and the owner. The miners were organized into a union, which indicated their comparatively high intellectual standard. I was thrilled with the thought of standing face to face with the miners and speaking to laborers from the platform. Besides, it was to be my first speech with a public audience. I hesitated, however, to practice on a critical radical group until the labor leaders assured me that my presence was indispensable. They said that the miners were willing to buy tickets for this meeting at 20 sen each to raise a fund for their union, so I could not resist any more. Miss Horace Coleman, the wife of an American missionary, voluntarily offered to accompany me, as she was herself genuinely sympathetic with the birth control movement. Miss Coleman and I took an early train to Nikko, where we changed to a local train, which climbed Ashio Mountain at the rate of 13 miles an hour, Miss Coleman cheering me during the journey with a cup of American cocoa and a lump of cheese, partly because I had a lump of lead somewhere in my throat at the thought of the obligation I had assumed. It was twilight when we arrived at Ashio. To my surprise and embarrassment, this little country station was filled with men and women, each with a lantern in the hand. I heard them say, "Let's see the lady of the peerage." When I walked out on the platform, the crowd followed, drawing near, holding their lanterns close, and scrutinizing my face as if they wanted to ascertain whether a person with a title belonged to the same or to a different genus in the animal kingdom. The meeting had already been going on a long time before I arrived, the only building large enough to house an audience of 2,000 miners and their wives carrying babies on their back and in both arms, was the local theater, to make the miners feel that they were getting the full value of the precious 20 sen, which they had paid for their tickets. The length of the meeting was a matter of consideration. 4 hours it lasted, with an army of speakers appearing on the platform, one after another. The chairman of the meeting asked me to talk for 2 hours, so that the audience would be thoroughly grateful. I did my best to meet the requirement, but my poor throat had not been trained for roaring to a crowd in the proletarian fashion. However, I managed to keep on speaking for at least 1 hour and a quarter. I too wished to be courteous. I began my speech with a statement of the birth control movement, and went on to discuss the ideal of a planned population for the betterment of the human race. Voluntary motherhood in its relation to the elevation of women, the necessity for birth control as a means of abolishing injurious abortion, infanticide, and everlasting poverty, connection between birth control and labor problems, and I closed with the moral aspects of the question. My speech was interrupted several times by the magnesium flashlights of the country press, accompanied by the sound of explosions and frightful odors, but I survived everything. The police inspectors in grand uniforms there were 3 of them, who gravely sat on the platform behind me, twice corrected me for using the word infanticide, saying it sounded too harsh for this occasion. I knew their interference was one of the formalities in a proletarian meeting, and that it was natural for the inspectors to want their presence acknowledged. Occasionally cheers came from the miners and their wives, who approved what I said. The wives were as attentive as they could be amid the duties of feeding their babies and changing their napkins. For the first time in their lives they were hearing a speech about the slavery of excessive childbearing and its relation to industry. A mixture of deep curiosity and blank amazement shone in their eyes as I gazed down upon them. The meeting ended with little of the uproar which usually accompanied a proletarian meeting, the greater part of the audience, as a rule, coming to enjoy a fight between speakers and policemen. The popular proletarian speakers were those who could outwit the policemen skillfully enough to hold the platform without breaking the regulations with respect to free speech, and at the same time deliver hot shots. It was a fine art, but policemen trained in this game of valor on their side seemed unprepared for a new competitor like me. I got off without a scuffle. The following day the same sort of meeting was held in another mining district, about 5 miles away, to which place the miners, who had heard me the night before, paraded with their Union flags in their hands, singing the song of revolution as they marched. Miss Coleman and I were utterly astonished, she the wife of a Christian missionary, I the wife of a peer, yet we joined in the parade, though it required a great deal of courage and idealism. This second meeting was likewise held in a village theater, and was packed with miners and their women, curious but enthusiastic. In my physical exhaustion on returning home, it was rejuvenating to hear immediately that the Miners' Union raised enough money at these meetings to carry on its work for a year ahead. Later I received hundreds of letters from the mining people asking for more information about birth control. They were taking the matter very seriously.